It was late September 1972 when the quiet town of Dixon, Illinois changed forever. The air had begun to cool, carrying the smell of cornfields and wood smoke, the kind of autumn that made the sky look endless and the nights come early. In a town of 12,000, everyone knew everyone else's name, or at least recognized their car. That's why when 24-year-old Emily Hart didn't show up for her shift at the pharmacy on Galena Avenue, people noticed immediately. Emily was the kind of person people remembered easily, not because she was loud or demanding, but because she had a calm, natural warmth. She'd grown up on the outskirts of Dixon, in a 2-story white house her father had built himself after coming back from Korea. She was the middle of 3 daughters, known for her laugh that carried across the yard, and for always having a book in her hand. She was engaged to a mechanic named Jack Weller, a man everyone liked, dependable, good-natured, with grease always under his fingernails, and a steady kind of love for her. That Friday evening, Emily left the pharmacy just after 6. Her co-worker, a girl named Denise, watched her wave goodbye and walked toward her blue '67 Mustang parked beneath the elm trees. She had plans to stop by her sister's house for dinner before heading home. The streetlights were flickering on when she pulled out of the lot. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. By Saturday morning, the worry had turned to fear. Jack called the police when he found her car abandoned near the edge of town, just off Route 26. The driver's side door was unlocked, her purse still on the front seat, and the keys lying in the grass nearby. The inside smelled faintly of perfume and rain. One of her shoes was found a few feet from the car. There were drag marks in the mud leading toward the trees. The sheriff's deputies combed the area, their flashlights cutting through the morning fog. Volunteers from town joined in, forming long uneven lines that stretched into the fields. They searched the woods, the riverbank, and the ditches that ran along the highway. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades thumping against the quiet countryside. But after 3 days, the search turned up nothing. Newspapers across northern Illinois carried her picture, a smiling young woman with chestnut hair and soft eyes. "Local woman missing," the headlines read. Her family pleaded for information on the nightly news. The reward fund grew as local businesses donated, determined to bring her home. The days turned into weeks. Rumors began to ripple through the community. Some said she'd run away. Others whispered about a stranger's car seen near the highway that night. The police interviewed Jack over and over, but his grief was too real to ignore. He'd spent every day since her disappearance handing out flyers, driving miles along country roads, calling her name into the fields like a prayer. Then, on October 10th, a farmer hunting near the Rock River made a grim discovery. About a mile from where Emily's car had been found, he noticed something pale caught in the underbrush. When he stepped closer, he realized it was a torn piece of fabric, blue with a faded floral pattern. Nearby, hidden beneath a blanket of leaves, were human remains. The sheriff's office cordoned off the area. The coroner identified her through dental records 2 days later. Emily Hart was dead. She had been strangled. The autopsy suggested she'd fought hard. There were bruises on her arms, defensive wounds on her hands, and dirt beneath her nails. The report said she died within hours of her disappearance. Dixon grieved like a family that had lost one of its own. The funeral filled the First Methodist Church to capacity. Her mother fainted twice before the service began. Jack stood by the casket, pale and shaking, holding one of Emily's favorite books, Wuthering Heights, in his hands. When it was over, the town fell silent. The investigation that followed stretched thin. The sheriff's department had limited resources and even less experience with murder. They interviewed more than 50 people. They questioned drifters, co-workers, truck drivers, anyone who might have seen something that night. But the leads went nowhere. No one had seen a struggle. No one had heard a scream. The rain that fell that evening had washed away footprints, tire tracks, everything. By the winter of '73, the case had grown cold. Her file was placed in a cabinet marked unsolved. The detectives moved on to other work, other crimes, though none of them forgot her. Some nights, when the station was quiet, a few of the older deputies would pull out her photo and sit in silence for a while, staring at her smiling face and the life that had been stolen away. Jack Weller never married. For years he kept the ring he'd bought for her in the drawer beside his bed. Every year on September 29th, the day she vanished, he placed flowers on her grave and stayed until dusk. Eventually, his visits became the only sign of life in the old cemetery. People would drive by and see him there motionless, as if waiting for her to return. In 1984, 12 years after Emily's death, the sheriff's department received a letter. It was anonymous, typed on an old Remington machine. The letter claimed to know who killed Emily. Hart. The writer named a local man who had lived near the river at the time and a loner named Raymond Cole. He had left Dixon shortly after the murder and was rumored to have joined a construction crew. Downstate detectives tracked Cole to Peoria, where he was living in a small rented trailer. They interviewed him, but he denied knowing Emily or having anything to do with her death. His alibi placed him working out of town the week she disappeared. With no physical evidence linking him to the crime, the case hit another dead end. By the early 1990s, much of the original evidence, the fabric, the hair samples, the soil, had been boxed and stored in the basement of the county courthouse. The files yellowed. The names on the tabs faded. New investigators came and went. The old ones retired or died, but the town still remembered her. Each anniversary, the local newspaper reprinted her photo and a plea for information. Then, in 2005, when a new sheriff took office, a deputy cleaning out storage discovered several sealed boxes from the Hart case. Inside were the old reports, photographs, and a small envelope labeled "Biological Unprocessed." Inside that envelope was a single fingernail clipping collected from Emily's left hand. It had been preserved in a paper packet, forgotten for decades. The deputy handed it to the sheriff, who recognized its significance immediately. DNA testing had come a long way since the 70s, even since the 90s. They sent the sample to the state lab in Springfield. The results came back 2 weeks later. There was foreign male DNA under Emily's nail, the kind left behind in a struggle. The lab uploaded the profile into CODIS, the national database, but there was no match. Whoever had killed her had never been caught for another serious crime. The case went cold again, but this time the door wasn't closed, just left slightly open. Over the next 15 years, the world changed. Technology advanced. New methods emerged. Techniques that could trace a person's ancestry, build genetic profiles from relatives, and narrow down suspects who'd once been invisible to investigators. Emily's case sat in that in-between space, waiting for the world to catch up. By the time 2022 arrived, Dixon had changed too. The old gas stations were gone, the diners replaced by chain restaurants, and the pharmacy where Emily once worked had become a thrift store. But her name still echoed in the town's history. For half a century she had been the question no one could answer. Then, 50 years after the night she vanished, an analyst at a private lab in Virginia called the Lee County Sheriff's Office with a result that would change everything. Familial match had been found. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning in the fall of 22. Detective Sarah Nolan had been with the Lee County Sheriff's Office for more than a decade, long enough to understand that most cold cases stayed cold. But when the message from the Virginia lab appeared in her inbox, something in her gut told her to open it right away. The subject line read, "Possible Genetic Association, Case 72104, Hart." She clicked. The message was short, clinical, the kind that hides the gravity of what it means. A genetic genealogy analysis had revealed a partial match between the unknown, male DNA found beneath Emily Hart's fingernail, and a distant relative living in Iowa. The relative had submitted their DNA years earlier through a consumer ancestry service. Through family trees and genealogical mapping, the lab's analysts had narrowed the connection to a single bloodline. The name that appeared on the final report made her pause. Cole. Nolan sat back, heart thudding. The name had appeared before this decades earlier. She remembered reading the old interview transcripts when she'd first reviewed the file. Raymond Cole, the man who'd left Dixon in 1972. The name had hovered on the edge of suspicion for half a century. She printed the report and walked straight to her captain's office. Within an hour, they'd reopened the Hart file officially for the first time in nearly 20 years. By that afternoon, Nolan was on the phone with the lab's lead genealogist, a patient woman named Laura Kemp. Together, they began retracing the Cole family line: birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, each piece a step closer to an answer. According to Kemp's mapping, the match pointed to a descendant of Raymond Cole's cousin. That meant the DNA likely came from someone within Raymond's immediate family, either him or one of his sons. Does Raymond have any living male relatives? Kemp asked. Nolan flipped through the old records. He had 2 sons, Michael and Dean, both born here in Dixon before he left. The older one, Michael, would be in his 70s now. Dean would be in his late 60s. What about Raymond himself? Nolan hesitated. He passed in 2009, cancer, buried in Peoria. There was a brief silence on the line. Then the DNA must belong to one of the sons, Kemp said finally. If we can find one willing to provide a sample, we can confirm it. By the end of that week, Nolan had located both men. Dean Cole lived in Missouri, working part-time as a handyman. Michael Cole had stayed closer, a retired truck driver living in Joliet. When she knocked on his door 2 days later, he answered in a flannel shirt, gray hair pulled into a small ponytail, eyes wary but sharp. Detective Nolan, she introduced herself. I'm with the Lee County Sheriff's Office. I'd like to talk to you about an old case from Dixon. He didn't invite her in right away. What kind of case? Emily Hart. For a moment the man's expression didn't change. Then his jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. Yes, she said quietly. 50 years. He stepped aside, motioning her in. The house smelled faintly of tobacco and engine oil. Old photographs covered the mantel. Family gatherings, fishing trips, birthdays. He poured himself coffee but didn't offer her any. My father talked about that case once, he said finally, sitting down. Said the police tried to pin it on him. Did he ever say why? He shrugged. Said it was because he was different. Kept to himself. People didn't like him much. He looked down at the table. He didn't do it. Nolan studied him quietly. Would you be willing to give a DNA sample? It's voluntary. It would help us eliminate your family from the investigation. He stared at her, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Why now? Because technology caught up, she said simply. And because Emily deserves to be remembered with truth, not rumor. He was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. Fine, take it. The swab took only seconds. She thanked him, left her card and drove back toward Dixon as the sun began to sink behind the flat farmlands. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Emily. The black and white photo from the file, the soft, trusting smile. For years, she'd been nothing but a ghost in the system, reduced to case numbers and reports. Now, for the first time, the air around her story felt alive again. 3 weeks later, the lab called back. The test from Michael Cole was negative. It wasn't him. Nolan felt the air tighten around her again. That leaves one, she said. They contacted Dean Cole next. He was more hesitant, skeptical of law enforcement, and didn't want to be dragged into something that happened before I was born. It took several phone calls and a promise that the process was routine before he agreed to meet. When they finally got his DNA sample, the analysis moved quickly. This time the call came earlier than expected. The lab technician's voice was calm, but deliberate. "Detective, we've confirmed a direct match between the DNA found under Emily Hart's fingernail and Dean Cole's biological profile. Probability of relation is beyond statistical doubt." Nolan sat still, letting the words sink in. 50 years, 5 decades of silence shattered by a microscopic thread of skin left behind in a struggle on a rainy night in 1972. Within hours, the sheriff's office obtained an arrest warrant. They coordinated with local law enforcement in Missouri. 2 detectives traveled there to assist. Dean Cole was arrested outside a hardware store in Springfield, where he worked part-time fixing lawnmowers. When they cuffed him, he didn't resist. He just looked at the officers and said quietly, "I wondered when you'd come." At the station, he sat across from Nolan in a small interview room. He was 70 years old now, thin and hollow-faced, with eyes that still carried a flicker of the boy he once was. The tape recorder clicked on. "Mr. Cole," Nolan began softly, "do you know why you're here?" He nodded. "Because of that girl. The one near the river. Emily Hart." He closed his eyes for a moment, his hands clasped together. "I was young, stupid, angry all the time. My dad used to hit me. I'd take the car, drive around just to breathe. That night I saw her on the road. She looked lost. I offered her a ride. She said no." The confession came in fragments, broken, stumbling, filled with the weight of years. He told her he'd grabbed Emily when she tried to walk away, that she'd fought him, that something inside him snapped. He hadn't meant to kill her, he said. It happened fast. When it was over, he panicked. He dragged her body into the woods and ran. He never told anyone, not even his father. Nolan watched him carefully, her heart steady but heavy. The story wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of evil you see in movies. It was the ordinary kind. The kind that grows quietly in anger and ends in irreversible harm. "Why now?" she asked. "Why tell the truth?" He looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I see her sometimes. I still see her." The recording stopped. When the sheriff's office announced the arrest, the town of Dixon erupted with a mix of disbelief and quiet vindication. Local papers ran side-by-side photos. Emily in 1972, smiling beneath the summer sun, and Dean Cole, now an old man with tired eyes. People who had long since stopped believing in answers found themselves crying again. It wasn't celebration. It was relief. Jack Weller, now in his 70s, received the news from a neighbor. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at the window where the morning light filtered through the curtains. Then he whispered, "She can rest now." For the first time in 50 years, the Hart family name was no longer followed by a question mark. The news spread through Dixon like a ripple through still water. It began with a brief statement from the Lee County Sheriff's Office, just a few sentences, confirming the arrest of 70-year-old Dean Cole in connection with the 1972 murder of Emily Hart. Local radio picked it up first, then the papers, then the evening broadcasts. Within hours, the story reached every porch, every grocery aisle, every quiet diner booth where people still remembered the girl with the auburn hair who never came home. For those who had lived there in the 70s, it was as if time folded in on itself. People who hadn't spoken of Emily in years suddenly found themselves telling her story again, where she used to work, what she liked to read, how she would hum under her breath while shelving books at the library. Some cried. Others simply sat in silence, remembering the fear that had settled over Dixon after her death. At the courthouse, the press gathered on the steps, cameras pointed toward the entrance. It was rare for a case that old to see the inside of a courtroom, rarer still for the suspect to be alive to stand trial. The state's attorney's office confirmed they would pursue charges of first-degree murder, emphasizing that new forensic evidence and a full confession gave the case unprecedented strength. Detective Nolan watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and unease. Closure was a complicated thing in her line of work. It didn't erase pain, it only gave it shape. She spent the following weeks preparing for the pre-trial hearings, compiling reports, cataloguing evidence that had been preserved through sheer luck. The original evidence box had survived decades in storage, moved from one building to another as the department expanded. The files were yellowed, the envelopes brittle, but the chain of custody had remained intact, allowing the DNA results to hold up in court. When she visited Emily's surviving relatives, the meeting was quiet and somber. Her younger sister, now in her 70s, lived in Rockford with her husband. She'd never stopped keeping Emily's photo on the mantel, a small black and white portrait. Edges worn from years of handling. "I didn't think I'd live to see this day," she told Nolan, her voice trembling. "Every night I'd pray someone would remember her, not just as a victim, but as a person." She was so full of light. Nolan nodded. People did remember her, even when it felt like no one did. Someone was still looking. At the first pre-trial hearing, Dean Cole appeared in shackles, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his head slightly bowed. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, townspeople, even a few who had once gone to school with Emily. Some whispered when they saw him, noting how frail he looked, how time had shrunk him into something small and almost unthreatening. But to those who remembered that night, he was still the shadow that had haunted Dixon for half a century. The judge read the charges, and Dean responded in a flat, steady voice. Not guilty. It wasn't unexpected. Despite his earlier confession, his public defender entered the plea automatically while they reviewed the case. Still, the words carried a sting, a reminder that even truth, once spoken, could be twisted by procedure. In the weeks that followed, the defense argued that Dean's confession was coerced, that he was old and confused, that the DNA evidence was insufficient because of contamination risk from decades of storage. But the lab's experts stood firm. The sample had been preserved in sealed evidence bags, catalogued properly, and cross-checked against multiple control tests. The probability of a false match was infinitesimal. The prosecution's narrative was simple. Emily Hart had fought for her life. The biological trace under her fingernail, skin cells belonging to Dean Cole, proved it. The confession aligned with the evidence, including tire marks from a vehicle consistent with his father's old car and fibers on Emily's clothing that matched the Cole family's upholstery pattern from the early 70s. As the legal motions dragged on, Dixon's residents began confronting what the case meant for them. For older citizens, it was a reopening of an old wound they'd tried to seal. For younger ones, it was the first time they truly understood the weight of their town's history. The local library, where Emily had worked, placed a small memorial table near the entrance, covered with wildflowers and photos donated by patrons who still remembered her smile. Even those who had doubted law enforcement in the past found themselves expressing gratitude. Sheriff's deputies began receiving letters from across the state, people thanking them for never giving up, even when decades passed without progress. But beneath the surface of relief, something darker stirred. Old suspicions reignited. Some townsfolk whispered about Raymond Cole, Dean's father, wondering if he had known all along. Others speculated that the family had hidden the truth, that their silence had allowed a murderer to live among them for 50 years. A few locals even vandalized the old Cole property outside town. Broken windows, spray-painted slurs, the remnants of anger that hadn't aged as gracefully as forgiveness. Detective Nolan drove out to the property one afternoon, standing at the edge of the overgrown yard. The house was abandoned now, peeling paint, broken porch steps, wind sighing through shattered glass. She imagined the boy Dean once was, standing there decades earlier, watching the world with quiet rage he didn't yet understand. She thought of Emily too, her laughter echoing in the library aisles, the way her co-workers described her as gentle but stubborn. She wondered if their paths had ever crossed before that night, or if fate had simply picked them out of the same sky and let them collide in the worst possible way. The trial began the following spring, By then, the story had drawn attention far beyond Illinois. National networks picked it up as one of the oldest cold cases in the state to end in a conviction hearing. Reporters descended on Dixon again, just as they had in the 70s. Cameras lining the courthouse steps, capturing faces of people who had aged half a century since the first tragedy. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with history. The prosecutor began by projecting Emily's photograph onto a screen, not as evidence but as a reminder. She was 30 years old, he said quietly. She had dreams, family, and a life ahead of her. For 50 years that life was silenced. Today we ask for her voice to be heard again. Dean sat motionless throughout, his expression blank, hands folded in front of him. He rarely spoke, only leaning toward his attorney to whisper occasionally. When the forensic experts testified, he stared at the table, his jaw tight. During one recess, a reporter managed to ask him a question as deputies led him out of the room. "Do you have anything to say to Emily Hart's family?" He stopped briefly, eyes unfocused. "I wish I'd walked away," he said. Then he kept moving. Outside, Emily's sister wept quietly into a handkerchief. "That's the first true thing he said," she murmured. As the trial moved forward, the past seemed to breathe again. Witnesses who had been young adults in 1972 took the stand, their memories fragile but still sharp in places. One recalled seeing a dark sedan idling near the river the night Emily vanished. Another remembered Dean's sudden disappearance from town afterward, how his father claimed he'd gone to work out of state. Each testimony, though imperfect, added texture to the story, the shape of a truth that had been buried for half a century. For Nolan, watching from the back of the courtroom, it was both satisfying and heartbreaking. Every fact, every exhibit, every piece of evidence represented years of waiting, of families growing old under the weight of questions. And now, at last, the truth stood in the light, trembling but undeniable. When the jury went into deliberation, the air in the courtroom turned heavy. The clock ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than it should. Reporters sat quietly, notebooks open, waiting for the kind of moment that could only come once in a generation. Family members of both Emily Hart and Dean Cole waited on opposite sides of the room, separated by 50 years of pain and a single wooden aisle. The jury was out for nearly 9 hours. They requested to see the photographs again, the fibers, the fingerprint comparisons, the DNA charts. They asked to hear portions of Dean's recorded confession a second time. Every replayed word made the walls feel closer. By the time the bailiff returned to announce that a verdict had been reached, the sun had already dipped below the Dixon skyline, the courthouse lights casting long, sharp shadows across the marble floor. When everyone rose, the silence was absolute. The foreman's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dean Cole, guilty of first-degree murder." A single gasp broke through the stillness. Emily's sister, who immediately covered her mouth with both hands, tears slipping down her cheeks. Nolan closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. It was done. Dean didn't look up. He stared straight ahead as the judge read the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a man of 71, it was a polite way of saying he would die behind bars. He nodded once, slowly, almost as if he'd expected it all along. When deputies led him away, he didn't resist. But as he passed by Emily's sister, he turned his head slightly, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm sorry." She didn't answer. Outside, the courthouse steps were packed with cameras and microphones. Reporters called out questions, flashes lighting up the cold evening air. "Detective Nolan, how does it feel to close a 50-year-old case? Do you think justice can still matter after so long?" Nolan paused on the top step, the autumn wind lifting strands of her hair. "Justice doesn't expire," she said. "It waits. Sometimes longer than we want, but it waits." That quote made headlines the next morning. But for the people of Dixon, the story wasn't about headlines. It was about